hope we are not missing anyone who wanted to come. So I would like to welcome all of you to this special session of our Oberseminar. And first of all, I have to extend the apologies of Professor Illies, who is still ill at home and who needs still some rest. So I kind of overtook his role of presenting briefly Professor Dr. Asmussen and to moderate this Oberseminar session. And second of all, we are kind of recording only this presentation, but if anybody wants to be exempted from this recording, please just let us know. But the camera is only focused on the presenters. So, okay, great. And we have some wines and waters. Okay, and in Germany, it's just normal. We kind of discuss over wine and over, some snacks. So if you like, please help yourself while I'm doing this introduction. So again, thank you very much for doing this presentation at University of Bamberg. So Professor Dr. Gabriel Asmussen, most of us already know, is from Brazil, and he has finished his PhD in Federal University of Minas Gerais. Yes. And he has done his work, as far as I know, about the early German Romanticism, especially about Schelling and also Novalis. And he's doing postdoc research, and I guess first in the same University of Minas Gerais, and then later in University of Ouro Preto.
Yes. Okay.
So, and he has also translated some important works of German philosophy, like Schelling and Novalis, but also Kant and Carl Gustav Jung, and also Professor Hösle. So he's also an expert in translation between German and Brazilian Portuguese,
yes,
as far as I understood. So, and today we kind of hear about his exposition about Schelling's theory of aesthetics and sexuality, which is also connected to some psychoanalysis, some psychoanalytic concept of sexuality. So I'm really thrilled, and without further ado, I will give word to Professor Dr. Asmussen. So, floor is yours.
Thank you, Tomoki. Well, first I would like to thank DAAD for the scholarship, which enabled me to come here and present my research to an international public. I would also like to thank Professor Christian Illies and Professor Vittorio Hösle, Professor Dr. Christian Illies and Professor Dr. Vittorio Hösle for invitation for summer school. And also I would like to thank Alexandra Wolf and Elena from the Welcome International, and Tomoki and Luisa for all the support with logistics and everything. And finally, I'm thankful to all of you for being here. I am not used to presenting in English. This will be actually the first time I make a longer presentation in English, so I will rely more on the text than usual, and I apologize for that. The studies on Schelling's work have been expanding in many countries. Key features that highlight this are the institution of the International Schelling Society and the editorial work of the historical critical edition Historisch-kritische Ausgabe since the 1970s and ongoing. One can say there has been a rebirth of Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling's studies and translations in Europe, Japan, the USA, and Brazil. The most popular research areas in this rebirth are: number one, Schelling's late philosophy, his critique of Hegel, and discussions on mythology and revelation. Number two, the philosophy of nature in the early Schelling, sometimes connected to ecological issues or discussions with contemporary science. One less popular area is number three, Schelling's philosophy of art or aesthetics. We aim to propose a reflection that connects 2 to 3, as was done by Assunção, Jacobs, and Schelling himself in works such as The System of Transcendental Idealism and The Philosophy of Art. There have also been Anglo-Saxon productions regarding the philosophy of nature intertwined with the philosophy of art. For example, Devin Zane Shaw and Daniel Whistler. Those interpreters emphasize the importance of the system of identity, which would be between 1801 to 1806 in Schelling's work, in and by itself, so that it is not just an intermediate period between Schelling's early and late intellectual production. Proof of this is that most of Schelling's insights about aesthetics stem from that period of his writings. Furthermore, he develops many debates with modern philosophy and distances himself from Kant and Fichte in this period, becoming gradually more influenced by Spinoza and the Platonic tradition, which he already knew very young. The nexus between Naturphilosophie and Philosophie der Kunst has not only proven its heuristic value, but requires more studies and further research. In the case of architecture, it is rare to see literature about Schelling's discussions on this form of art, even though his reflections on it are intriguing. We shall not enter historical issues, such as Assunção and Arne's Ernst, but we recognize this is an important field to understand Schelling's philosophy of architecture, and we support its study. We can also discuss this during the discussion moment, if you want. However, we will focus on his ideas regarding the formative drive, Bildungstrieb, and its nexus with architecture and sexuality. Although this physiological concept is no longer used in biology or medical sciences, the speculative insight that connects architecture with sexual impulses and our places is lasting. The nexus between sexuality and artistic creativity deserves more attention in Schelling's studies. Therefore, we aim to develop a topic briefly mentioned in classic works such as Jacobs and Zeltner's, even though the subject has heuristic value. Furthermore, we aim at a dialogue with a theoretician from the field of psychoanalysis. The matter of sublimation is a popular topic in psychoanalysis. This concept was coined by Sigmund Freud and is still popular as a bridge between psychology, arts, and culture in general. However, we aim to dialogue with Wilhelm Reich, who offered a different approach to this concept and considered architecture in relation to sexuality. In particular, his work on the inhibition of a sexual revolution in the former Soviet Union, a work called The Sexual Revolution from 1936, is our focus. Our interest in dealing with psychoanalysis is neither in the problematic concept of unconscious, das Unbewusste, nor in a connection with Schelling's non-conscious or a-conscious, bewusstlos. Schelling's idea of non-conscious, deprived of consciousness, would at best relate to Freud's conception of descriptive unconscious, which is the less important concept of unconscious to psychoanalysis. The most important notions of unconscious to psychoanalysis are dynamic unconscious, which means when ideas fight their way to get back into our consciousness, or also the economic unconscious, which has to do with the distribution of libido, the sexual energy in our mind. Our focus is on how Schelling and Reich reflect on artistic creativity, architecture, and sexuality. In his first published text focused on the philosophy of nature, Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature, Schelling states that human beings transform nature, determining it according to ends and intentions, supposedly exerting dominion upon it. However, this exercise of power itself is only possible due to the nature human beings struggle to dominate. Human beings are a part of nature and are also the result of an evolution in which the spirit can be productive in two manners, either blind and non-consciously, as in the case we will see the regularity of the forms of nature, for example, the products of animals, or the spirit can produce free and conscious, recognizing itself as the ideal aspect of nature. Philosophy overcomes this distinction between conscious and non-conscious by recognizing an identity between states, since both come from a common root, which Schelling will call interchangeably absolute, reason, Vernunft, or God, Gott. He will use the three terms interchangeably during this period of his work. He already uses this term actually 1 year earlier in the practical philosophy section of the system of transcendental idealism from 1800. This identity between conscious and non-conscious is exteriorized in the artistic products of genius and also in the products of nature. In both cases, there is a perfect balance between ideal and real, conscious and unconscious, nature and spirit. The non-conscious products of nature are mistaken attempts of nature to reflect on itself, which fails due to a lack of self-consciousness that only appears in human beings. So to Schelling, there is reason, even in minerals, plants, non-human animals, but this is a reason that is blind, Schelling will say, a reason that is not aware of itself. In human being, this is the first time when this will happen, according to Schelling. Originally, spirit and nature were one, but this unification has been lost due to the human powers of abstraction. Philosophy of nature aims at reintegrating human beings with nature, making the former recognize itself as part of the latter. With this, it is possible to reconcile consciousness and non-consciousness, subjective and objective, real and ideal and real, spirit and nature. So Schelling notices during his works that the human mind has a tendency to be dualistic. That's why he uses all those divisions, which come also from the Kantian philosophy. But he also believes that the artists and the philosophers can try to bring back this unity between spirit and nature. So this is a large part of his philosophical project in his early decades of production. In nature's transition from fluid to solid state, it produces regular forms, such as crystallization. Also, we can see nature's productivity as a perfect geometer in the movement of the heavenly bodies. In the animal kingdom, a product of blind, it is non-conscious forces of nature, some actions resemble the ones that occur consciously, and even resemble works of art, such as nests, beaver dams, beehives, and formicaria. This topic relates directly to the Bildungstrieb or formative drive. In 1781, the physician and physiologist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach published the first edition of his essay, Über den Bildungstrieb, on the formative drive. It could be impulse too, but the more common translation we see in secondary literature is drive. In this essay, there is an impulse that differs from other forces of nature, and it is precisely the formative drive. in the case of generation, nutrition, and reproduction. The term Bildungstrieb, or nisus formativus, is named after the concept of Kunsttrieb, artificial drive, present in the works of Hermann Samuel Heimarus, or Heimarus maybe. This concept became central not only for developing life sciences in the 18th century, but also for aesthetics and cultural orientation in the 1790s. Based on the study of algae and polyps, Blumenbach notices that generation, nutrition, and reproduction are modifications of this formative drive. In the first case, it builds generation. In the second, it preserves nutrition, and in the third one, reproduction, it repairs. The physician admits that the formative drive presupposes a passage from inorganic realm to organic, but does not explain it, leaving its cause unknown. We can only derive the effects of the formative drive from experience. This is an issue criticized by Schelling, although he admits the formative drive works on organic matter, corresponding to an aspect of nature that allows it to produce its arrangements free and according to laws, consciously free and non-consciously according to laws at the same time. When Schelling says objective and non-conscious at this stage of his work, it's usually relating to nature's activity, to non-human nature. However, the formative drive is only an expression of the primordial unit between freedom and necessity, or freedom and accordance to laws, in all of the natural formations, and not a ground of explanation for the unification itself. The formative drive presupposes organic matter, and therefore cannot indicate a cause for the organism. Instead, it presupposes a higher cause of the organisms. The higher cause of life, according to Schelling, is nature's productivity, or, as he uses, natura naturans. The three cases mentioned by Schelling, a geometry in the movement of the celestial bodies, the regularity of shapes in crystals, minerals, and the complexity of the animal kingdom, which displays some sort of pre-human art, these three forms are interpreted according to the idea there is a non-conscious productivity originally connatural to the conscious productivity, and this is the productivity of nature. This may sound a little strange, but Schelling's basic idea here is that nature is an eternal flow of production, never stopping, never ceasing, but leaving some traces of this production. And the traces of nature's production are the shaped things, nature's products, be it minerals, plants, bees, or human beings. So natural science will study the objects, the products of nature, and natural philosophy or philosophy of nature will study productivity. One would be incomplete without the other. So it's very interesting because Schelling is always willing to dialogue with natural science, and he did study a lot of the many studies from his time. He studied Benjamin Franklin, Galvani, Volta, Lavoisier, Stahl, and many others. Blumenbach has tried to present the functioning of the formative impulse in 6 laws. 1. The power of the formative drive ceases with the aging of the organism. 2. The formative drive is remarkably superior in its power in mammals rather than ovipara. 3. Its course of action can be different in distinct organs and parts. The brain is constantly formed, whereas the kidneys and internal organs vary. 4. The formative drive may change its direction. 5. The deviation of the formative drive results in hermaphroditism. 6. Differences do not mean something strange, but an anti-natural guiding of the formative drive, with abortion as a possible consequence. The second law is quite interesting since, according to it, mammals have a stronger formative drive than ovipara. This could testify in favor of an evolution of animal constructions from insects to mammals, and within mammals, human beings capable of the most complete architecture. The laws 2 and 4 are explored not only by Schelling, but also, for example, by August Wilhelm Schlegel, whose doctrine of art, Kunstlehre, was a major influence in Schelling's philosophy of art. Schelling wrote to Schlegel, there's a letter he says, I'm holding your Künstler with one hand and writing with the other. So he was doing basically what we do all the time, having to hold a book with one hand and write it. So even Schelling also had to write a lot to understand what he was reading. And so never give up on this. August Schlegel also discusses the geometrical regularity in the context of architecture, with an argumentation similar to Schelling's. In his text, Einleitend zu seinem Entwurf eines Systems der Naturphilosophie, introduction to his project of a system of philosophy of nature, displayed above. According to Schlegel, inorganic nature is productive with geometrical regularity, undisturbed. In contrast, organic forms are incapable of a mathematic construction, since they are in a base that constitutes symmetry, and they are not in a base that constitutes symmetry in proportion of all shapes. In the passage from liquid to solid, water freezes in straight lines and determined angles. Salt and minerals crystallize themselves in regular prisms, columns, and other multi-sided shapes. We can also think about snowflakes, for example. Phenomena such as the force of gravity operating in the fall of a body or the collision between bodies can be calculated based on directions and angles. In this sense, mathematical formulae are an expression of the core powers of nature's effects. In the case of organisms, individuals determine themselves, being a nature within nature. And here Schelling has a very interesting concept called Scheinprodukt. He thinks that all products of nature are also apparent products, because they are not merely objects of nature, but they carry within themselves the productive power of nature. Organic formations are not only geometrical, but also guided by the formative drive. Examples of this case are, besides the beaver dam that I mentioned, are the birds' particularly round nests and the cocoons of silk moths, spider webs, and beehives formed by regular angles, and also they are cause for admiration. We are impressed by that. There is a city in my state called São João del Rei. In the highway to that city, there is a field where you can see like maybe 20 to 30 formicaria. It's amazing. It's very beautiful. And if you ever go to Minas Gerais, Brazil, I recommend you visit São João del Rei and see this in the road. It is also a very beautiful historical city. Many animal cuirasses or carapaces are built regularly, even though we do not attribute an artistic element to them, e.g., in the case of shells and snails, nearly amorphous beings, the houses of which are spirals or cones. Schelling further develops Schlegel's insights, conceiving the artificial drive as a determined modification or redirection of the universal formative drive. He explains it based on the fact that in most species the artificial drive is equivalent to the impulse to procreation, as in the case of the worker bees. In other species, the phenomenon of the artificial drive is parallel to the animal's metamorphosis and sexual development, and with the sex being developed, the artificial drive disappears. Furthermore, there are species in which the exteriorization of the artificial drive temporarily precedes the mating, such as in the case of many birds. Asexuality, according to Schelling, is not shown neither in the animal kingdom nor in the vegetable one, and there are sexual functions even in polyps. The closest things to asexuality would be when there is no other specific direction of the formative drive. In most insects, the artificial drive consists in equivalent of the sexual drive, as in the case of the worker bees, the only productive ones. These bees are the ones by which the formation of a queen bee is reached. In her, the formative drive of all other remaining bees is focused. It is noteworthy that most insects lose their artificial drive after sexual development. I was based here not only in Schelling, but on the wonderful volume of the historical critical edition by Manfredone, Francesco Moiso, and let me just check it here, and Jörg Janssen. They have a special volume in the historical critical edition of Schelling's work, just focused on the natural sciences that Schelling has studied. It's an amazing work, and you have it here in the library. So enjoy it, have fun. And bees produce from themselves the matter of their buildings. The spider and the silk moth take from themselves the threads of their webs, and there are also cases in which the artificial drive loses itself totally in superior organic sedimentations, which may remain in cohesion with the producer, e.g., products of polyps that reside in coral reefs, the shells of mollusks and oysters, and even the exoskeletons of some insects and crabs. I think it would not be too bold to say that the armors that people used in the Middle Ages, for example, and similar equipments may be inspired by exoskeletons, whether directly or not. In these cases, the artificial drive is lost after being extruded in these carapaces' production. He mentions that all of these animals are guided by a powerful spirit that shines with the most intensity in human beings. Given these presuppositions and concepts from Schelling's philosophy of nature, let us consider architecture. In classic German philosophy, the question regarding purposiveness in architecture is common, and it could compromise it as a fine art, considering architecture is an artistic form so deeply connected to the concept of an end exterior to it. Since its canon, Vitruvius, Kant, for instance, states that gardening and architecture differ fundamentally, since gardening does not own a concept of an object as its end, as does architecture. And this concept conditions architecture's arrangements, which enables gardening more freedom to the imagination during the contemplative act. And in this aspect, gardening would be freer than architecture. This is on the third critique. And it's very strange that Schelling does not consider gardening in his philosophy of art, since he is always considering art in relation to nature. It's very curious. I wonder, I still haven't discovered why. Maybe someday I will. I'll just have a glass of water. Vitruvius was a Roman military engineer whose De Architectura on architecture, written between 30 and 15 Anno Domini, is the BC, I guess. I think I wrote wrong here. BC is the only treatise of the genre from ancient times that has survived. Vitruvius influenced Alberti, Raphael, and Michelangelo, and his work is a classic in the history of architecture, civil engineering, and urbanism. According to Vitruvius, the architectonic work must be executed to respect the three following principles: solidity, firmitas, functionality, utilitas, and beauty, venustas. Solidity is observed since the excavation and the steadiness of the soil, the materials to be used. This is also considered to some extent by Schlegel in his Kunstlehre. He discusses a lot the role of gravity and the materials you can use in a building. Functionality, on the other hand, which we can understand here as purposiveness, refers to a well-executed work without impediment to the use of the soil and the appropriate sections adapted to sunlight. Finally, beauty relates to the work's elegance and pleasantness, the measure of the parts that correspond to each other, and the logic of commensurability. Beauty can be observed, for example, in the parallel between temples and the proportions of the human body, a mimetic element in architecture. And this is very interesting because in the Gothic cathedrals, many times you don't have this proportion, and this creates a feeling of dislodgement, of being somehow lost in the place, and this produces somehow a feeling of the sublime. So a small Gothic cathedral may cause a feeling of smallness larger than if you were in a Renaissance church, for example, because in the Renaissance church you have this respect to the proportions of the human body. And Schelling does not explore this. This I based on Erwin Panofsky, but this is something that could be really interesting to think relating to Schelling's concept of the sublime. Okay. So there is this element, right, in Gothic architecture, emphasizing the smallness and the humbleness of human being. Schelling deals with the apparent duality between purposiveness and beauty in architecture with three arguments. Here is the philosophy of art. It's from Schelling's posthumous works, and you have it here too in the library. I borrowed it for some research and also for today. I reread some sections of it. I didn't have access to this particular volume before. I used the classical Sämtliche Werke one from the edition by Schelling's son, Karl. But this edition has a very interesting critical apparatus. It's really good. I also recommend this. So here in the section 4, Schelling discusses many plastic arts, among which he considers architecture to be a plastic art. So he deals with the objection of purposiveness in architecture with three arguments. The first one considers purposiveness in architecture not as a principle of the artistic character of architecture, but only as its technical aspect. Purposiveness, therefore, is only the form of manifestation of a work of architecture, not the essence of it. Yeah, not the best argument. The second one, so beauty somehow transcends the element of utility. The second argument is more interesting, and it recurs to a concrete work of art, Vesta's temple. I quote Schelling, "There are architecture genres in which necessity and utility completely disappear, and the works themselves already constitute an expression of ideas, independent of necessity, absolute in themselves." He develops, end quote, he develops this idea based on his concept of symbol. A symbol to Schelling is something that is a universe in itself. It is a closed entity. So in his conception of myths, he adopts an anti-allegorical position. So the myth does not represent something exterior to it. The myth represents itself. He will use the expression later in the philosophy of mythology, tautegory, instead of allegory to the myth. So, for example, according to Schelling, Zeus does not represent thunder. Zeus is thunder itself. Amaterasu from Japanese mythology does not represent the sun. It is the sun in Schelling's conception. So he has this interesting notion. It somehow leads back to Kant, also in the third critique, the idea of beauty as a symbol of good, but he develops it based in Kant, but also criticizing Kant, and emphasizing this aspect that the symbol is an autonomous entity, such as nature. It is a closed system, the same way nature is. This idea of self-determination is very important in Schelling's philosophy as a whole. It will be present in philosophy of nature, transcendental philosophy, and his philosophy of mythology. The third argument is the most consistent with Schelling's system. According to it, architecture elevates itself to transcend purposiveness, being its object and imitating itself, allegorically suggesting the organic, employing the inorganic. So this is a little tricky because I just mentioned symbol and that Schelling criticizes allegory. But to Schelling, inside the system of arts, he divides all the arts in two main sides. The ideal side, which would correspond more to literature, to many forms of literature, poem, epos, drama, and so on, comedy. In the real side of arts that relates to plastic arts And he has a very broad idea of plastic arts. He considers music, a plastic art, painting, architecture, sculpture, and the bas relief. There is a group he calls plastic, and in this group there are three forms of art: architecture, bas relief, and sculpture, which to him would be the highest of the plastic arts. There are also some arts that are mixed. He considers it very quickly, such as dance, for example, theater. It would be a mix of plastic arts and ideal arts. But the point is that being the first step in the system to Schelling is usually related to this allegorical aspect in his system of arts. So, for example, music is allegorical, and architecture would be the correspondent of music in his system. It's a little strange, I know. We could discuss it further after the presentation, but basically the idea here is that architecture is a weaker form of art in this scope of the three-dimensional arts, which he calls plastic: architecture, bas relief, and sculpture. It would be the weakest one because of all these links with the vegetable kingdom. The dynamic, okay, I'll skip this. The three forms of architecture are imitations of the most rudimentary forms of architecture, e.g., wooden architecture. Initially, such a form was a matter of necessity. Later, it was imitated by free art, elevating itself to an artistic form, reconciling objective and subjective. I quote, "Architecture, to be a fine art, must present the purposiveness that is in it as an objective purposiveness, it is, as an objective identity between concept and thing, subjective and objective." End quote. In imitating itself as a mechanical art, architecture overcomes this kind of human activity, being elevated to a fine art that is beyond the simple dimension of use. And ergologically, it represents vegetables to Schelling. This is very based in Vitruvius too. Vitruvius works a lot this allegory between vegetable forms and nature. The bases of buildings are like roots and columns, analogous to large logs, although transformed by human creativity in such a way that the impulse towards architecture is animal, the formative drive, and its model is vegetable. He discusses in long length the Strasbourg Cathedral when he makes these comparisons. The passage from architecture to sculpture represents in the interior of Schelling's system of arts the evolution from the vegetable to the animal, and within the animal realm towards human beings, the canon of classical sculpture. For the vegetable allegory to be satisfactory, it is necessary to respect symmetry in the whole, and also a perfected finish. The flowers are an example of a limit to the vegetable's growth, analog to human heads. Sometimes Schelling works those very unusual analogies. He has this idea that the bird's feathers, they descend from the vegetable's leaves and those kinds of things. Sometimes it can be a little strange, but still a very creative philosopher, very interesting to read. The bases of the columns are fascinating in this context, since it is the element that objects to Schelling's idea of a vegetable allegory, and he recognizes this. It represents a detachment from the soil. We can also see it in it a movement towards partial freedom from the ground, and the domes and vaults of some buildings are praised by the philosopher as a representation of the word soul itself, a perfect totality, which for Schelling is a Greek predecessor of his concept of nature's productivity. So Schelling will use a lot the expression Weltseele. He will have a book from 1796 called 1798, Von der Weltseele. So this will be a very important conception to him that rings back to ancient philosophy, but he will try to think it in a modern way of sorts. As animals, humans are already present in architecture's proportions, the most meaningful forms being the ones closer to the top of the buildings. So there are some columns that have those little spirals and curves, which are like the women's heads, women's hairs when they have these curls. It's inspired by Greek women curls. The most meaningful, the medium parts of a tower represent the thoracic cage, and the main ornaments are comparable to the human head, externally indicated as the seat of thoughts. These comparisons will be very important when Schelling discusses sculpture, and this importance of the head to Schelling will be very beautifully discussed. It's one of the most beautiful parts of the philosophy of art when he discusses sculpture, the symbolic meaning of the eyes, the mouth. It will be very inspired by Plato's Timaeus, as was noticed by Fernando Rey Puente, who is a Brazilian scholar and a friend of mine, who is a great researcher of Schelling and Aristotle. Something Schelling represses, now we're going to psychoanalysis, is the fact that in the case of plants, the limit being the flower is their sexual organ, which he could have related one more time to architecture in its connection to sexuality. Here, we leap from philosophy to psychoanalysis, in a perspective of a fruitful dialogue between the two fields. It is not a genetic work, but a dialogue between Schelling's and Wilhelm Reich's insights on why sexuality is important in architecture. This is very nice because I've always wanted to work this connection, but I was very tired of reading Freud because I read Freud during many years of my life, so I needed a vacation from psychoanalysis. So this is important too. I give you this tip. Don't give up on an interesting idea. Just let it simmering for some time, maybe some years, and eventually it can come back with very interesting fruits. Still in Schelling, the system of transcendental idealism is one of Schelling's most logically organized and methodologically careful works. Considering this, it can be surprising that almost at the end of this work, on the famous section, main section 6 about the philosophy of art, Schelling uses psychological considerations as an argument to endorse his views on artistic creation and the connection between nature and spirit a work of art provides. Not transcendental arguments, but psychological. Not only does the philosopher mention statements from artists about a relief from an irresistible impulse which is satisfied through the production of works of art, but Schelling also mentions this artistic impulse. The expression he uses, künstlerische Trieb, rooted in or artistic drive, if we follow the regular Anglo-Saxon translations, artistic impulse rooted in a feeling of contradiction, so deep it reaches the root of one's existence. Also, according to artists, you see the expression, according to artists, artistic production brings about a feeling of harmony and commotion. So these are all psychological considerations, social considerations. One wonders if Schelling undertook empirical research to ground these statements, and I don't doubt that he did some rudimentary form of research because he was always living among artists, so he could have made very many notes talking to them, things like that. It's something to think about. One equipped with psychoanalytic studies can't be unable to notice the erotic charge of these statements connected to Schelling's conception of artistic productivity. According to Sigmund Freud, sublimation is the capacity to divert a sexual aim to a non-sexual one, which is usually possible through artistic creations and dedication to religion or even science. One important moment in the genesis of the concept of sublimation is when Freud argued with Carl Gustav Jung on the concept of libido in his 1914 paper on narcissism. Jung believed the Freudian theory of the libido was unable to explain schizophrenia, since the fantasies would be deeply connected to one's interior world and not to outside objects. There are many kinds of schizophrenia, but for example, an easier one to understand is the paranoid schizophrenia. It is very common, unfortunately, at least in Brazil, you see people in the streets. Based on what they say, it is very likely that they have this kind of mental suffering. It's, for example, if someone believes believes deeply that he is. In the early 2000s, it was common to see people in mental institutions who believed they were Neo from the Matrix, and they were trapped in a world of fiction because everything was made by machines and so on and so forth. It is very common for people to believe they are a prophet, or they are Jesus, for example, or they are being persecuted by that green bow behind Giulio over there, for example. So it can be, it is not only a delusion, but a delusion followed by hallucinations. That's why I mentioned a green bull, for example, or that movie, A Beautiful Mind. It presents it somehow in a loose way. Usually when they picture mental diseases in movies, it's a mix of many of them. It's usually not a very accurate portrayal, but we could also think about this. For example, I could think that there are agents of the FBI watching me or everything. Actually, with the cell phones nowadays, it's not so far from the truth, but who knows. But usually, the schizophrenic paranoia will have this strong seizure from reality. You create your own reality, and you may even use some arguments to convince other people about that. Paranoia is also a psychosis, but it is usually more related to rationalization, to extreme rationalization of one's delusion. The schizophrenic paranoia is usually harder to believe precisely because of the fake perceptions, because of the hallucination. Then you won't have intersubjective agreement on the hallucinated content. So basically, Jung was objecting, but in this case, Freud, how do you explain this based on libido if the person is completely apart from the external world? This point Freud will only be able to answer some years later, but the other objection is more important here. Jung makes us question if Freud's theory of libido is correct at all, as in the case of an anchorite who does not have sexual interest in other people. As a response, Freud differentiates between the ego's libido and object libido, evolving his concept of narcissism. Narcissism, it was a neologism by Freud. He wrote narcissismus and not narcissismus. So Freud he created this word narcissismus, based of course on the myth of Narcissus. And let's see here, I'm sorry. So narcissism is basically an investment of libido in one's own self or ego, which happens since early childhood. Yeah, there's an expression, Freud here. There's an expression Freud uses. He uses it in English in the original text. His Majesty the baby. That's how the parents consider their kids. And this is already erotic to Freud. Because to Freud, eroticism and sexuality are related to interest in things we do. It's not only the sexual activity per se, but it's related to the care we give other people, to the importance we give to other people's opinions. Everything in this sense is erotic to Freud. So when the parents, they say that, oh, my prince, my little queen, my little princess, the baby is already feeling that the world is his to take and to seize. So it begins from early childhood and goes on during life. And for example, I'm here and I'm lecturing to all of you, and I could be like, oh, are they buying what I'm saying? Are they thinking I'm saying silly things or whatever? So this could happen, this can happen. We always have a little stage fright, and we are always worried about other people's opinion. It has to do with our narcissistic constitution. And it is important for our survival, according to Freud. It does not bring only bad things like selfish attitudes and everything, but it leaves one to value him, her, themselves, and consider important things to foster their own development. This is a very rich concept in Freudian theory. Narcissism is a very rich concept, and it has very many interesting results in cultural reflections. Christopher Lasch, for example, wrote A Culture of Narcissism about the North American society in the 70s, I think, or 80s. So it's a very interesting concept. And here, with this concept, Freud says that even if someone is a monk or an anchorite, he can sublimate his libido into higher objects, such as the divine, animals, or the cosmos. Therefore, according to Freud, every interest is libido, thus presenting a sexual origin. This is what I referred to earlier at the beginning when I mentioned there's an economic notion of unconscious in Freud. So economic unconscious is related to the distribution of libido. Freud uses many economical metaphors in his work. Circulation of the libido, for example, and investment of libido. They use terrible words in the English translations. They try to make Freud very scientific, so they use catexis instead of investment of libido. They use the id instead of das ist, which is what Freud uses. There are many, it's a very troublesome translation, the one by James Strachey and others. Okay, and in Brazil it was a big problem, just a curiosity, because Brazilian translations of Freud were originally second-hand translations from the English one, so they had all the mistakes from the English translations of Freud. But after Freud's works went into public domain, now we're having translations of very high quality, and who knows, now that I'm back to psychoanalysis, maybe I could try something too, who knows. But coming back to this paragraph, I know this was a little too much information, but according to Freud, basically, even if you are a person who does not engage in sexual activities, you still have sexual interest in the world. Not only this sexual interest per se, but in this broader Freudian sense. You invest libido in many things from the world. In painting, you can dedicate to guitar, to many things, to the search of a higher being, to theoretical knowledge, right? You can write a long work about the free will, right? And like Augustine, that you study so much. And this is one idea of Freud. But our focus, as I mentioned, is Wilhelm Reich. I just gave this broader account to make us more acquainted with this discussion of this concept of sublimation, which is related to artistic creativity in Freud and also to religious beliefs. Wilhelm Reich presents a different concept of sublimation. He was an Austrian psychoanalyst interested in body language, repressions, and the human armor. That's the English translation of the term pança. In Brazil, the official translation is couraça, which would be like a carapace. Through his intellectual development, he was initially interested in the individuals, then in society, when he was close to Marxism, and then became disillusioned with Marxism, and then in nature as a whole. He developed this idea of a sort of a cosmic energy called orgone. Adult sexuality is important to him, not only in a symbolic way, such as is usually the case with Freud, but as a body activity crucial to life. The goal of sexual intercourse is not prowess, but letting oneself go during the sexual embrace. It leads to a more creative approach to life and makes modern men and women less afraid of losing control. Reich defends many abnormal psychic reactions are due to misdirected and unsatisfied sexual energy. The energy governs the structure of human emotions and cognitions. Therefore, the suppression of sexuality equals to a disturbance of core life functions, leading to irrational human action, readiness to engage in wars, and ultimately to fascism, including red fascism, as became the case in the Soviet Union, according to Reich. Sexual politics, a field of investigation dear to these psychoanalysts, asks for the reason. Why is there suppression of one's love life? Reich's work, The Sexual Revolution, is a work written between 1918 and 1935, and is the result both of his medical experiences and his visits to Soviet communes. Socialism tries to condense nature in sexual abstinence and sacrifice for nationalistic purposes, while work democracy, Reich's ideal of a political regime which would be closer to what we call social democracy, tries to bring the individual and society to an integration with nature, being against sexual suppression, exploitation, and nationalism. The inhibition of the sexual revolution in the Soviet Union led to regression to authoritarian principles. Regression in psychoanalysis has some meanings. In dreams, for example, we regress to previous states of our mental life, or even to of the day we had. But it can also mean a return to childish structures. Usually when we are frustrated, disappointed about something, we may turn to the habit of collecting things in a disordered manner, like hoarding. So hoarding would be a return to the oral stage of development in Freud, which relates a lot to introjecting things, to absorbing things, to try to bring things to yourself. This could be an example of regression. Sublimation, to Reich, is only possible under an ordered sex economy, which means society with the possibility of sexual gratification that corresponds to one's age. So Reich makes a play with this economical meaning of unconscious, and he uses this ambiguous term, sex economy. It's related both to the economy of libido and to the economic organization of a society. Not many patients are capable of sublimation, being faced either with rejection of impulses or the repression of them. Even though Reich recognizes sublimation leads to essential achievements of culture and the psychic apparatus, he deems it impossible where there is sexual repression. Psychic apparatus is an expression of psychoanalysts to refer to the human mind. It's because Freud also bases his conceptions of psychism in a sort of hydraulic model with all this distribution and flow of libido, so he calls it the sexual apparat. And in the case of the adult, sublimation applies only to pregenital impulses, like the oral impulse I mentioned, but not to adult genital impulses. So to Reich, a healthy sexual life leads to sublimation and not the other way around. Very bold and very creative. It's no wonder he was excommunicated from the psychoanalytic society, because who disagreed with Freud or Anna Freud, his daughter, usually ended up doing their own thing, like Carl Jung did, or ended up excommunicated, as was the case with Reich. In the former Soviet Union, attempts to suppress the family led to unhappiness among citizens who were unable to cope with the lack of proper space to have sexual intercourse in the youth communes. So because of Marx's writings, they had these elements against the family, and they took it very seriously in the Soviet Union. Hence, the social revolution did not correspond to a sexual revolution, as was believed. It was believed it would be like this. But actually what happened was the control of personal lives in the interest of the party, and a contradiction between a reactionary attitude regarding sexual life and a revolutionary attitude in economic and politics, which led to an inhibition of the sexual revolution. I will quote here. What is the basis of this confused thinking? The failure to distinguish the pathological sexuality of youth, a sexuality which was at variance with cultural achievement, from healthy sexuality, which is the physiological basis of cultural achievement, the antithesis of a mere woman, that is, sensual woman, and human being, that is, an active, sublimating woman, instead of realizing that the sexual awareness and self-confidence on the part of the woman is the psychic basis of her social emancipation and activity, the antithesis of living out an ideal relationship, instead of realizing that the capacity for full sexual surrender to the beloved partner is the safest basis for a companionship, end quote. A beautiful, very sensible passage in Reich's works. And there are some misconceptions about him. And he also was kind of a strange guy, but you'll see some very interesting passages. He had some very remarkable reflections too. Some examples Reich mentions are elucidating. The youth commune at the State Library of Moscow prohibited close relationships, and even pieces of underwear were uniform. People who went against these injunctions were attacked as destroyers of communist ethics. A rare positive example was the work commune Bolshevo for delinquents. There were no sexual difficulties there, and men had relationships with people from the environs. The communards there discussed sexual matters with each other, and excesses were rare. They developed an art gallery, a library, a chess club, and a movie theater. So according to Reich, many possibilities for sublimation. Communes basically failed only when they bureaucratically regulated sexual living. In many of them, there was no closed space for sexual intercourse, which became a major problem. And now to the conclusion. Both Schelling and Reich link artistic creativity in architecture with some kind of suppression of sexuality. Schelling brings this issue from a philosophical point of view, but when we consider previous psychological considerations about the artist's creative process, we open a path for a dialogue with Wilhelm Reich. An additional gain is Reich's alternate view on sublimation, which poses serious questions to Freud. We do not mean with this discussion that architecture cannot suggest sexuality in its simple shapes, or that there are no spaces that enable sex, such as hotels and love hotels. I here make an honorable mention to Andreas Gruner, the professor who is a big fan of Oscar Niemeyer, a Brazilian architect who is known for the influence of the sensuality of the Brazilian woman in his works. Works are very curvy, very interesting. I recommend you guys see it if you don't know him, and if you do, it's always nice to see again. Oscar Niemeyer. There are even love hotels in Brazil and Japan, which are designed for a discreet and intimate moment for couples. Not necessarily as extramarital relationships, but usually, for example, university students, people who still live with their parents. In Brazil, it takes more time for people to leave their parents' homes, basically because we are too poor. So it's a reality we have there. And we have, it's called motel in Brazil. Like it's not motel like in the American movies, which usually is a cheap hotel by the road. The motels can be in the roads. They can also be in more busy areas. It varies a lot. And in Japan, they also have the love hotels, which are usually next to the train stations. It's also very practical. Tomoki is remembering something. I'm kidding. In all these cases, we see architecture imitating itself, which is one of its core characteristics, according to Schelling. This imitation, as is mostly the case with Schelling, regarding true mimesis, means recreation and transformation. Besides discussing philosophy and architecture, Schelling and Reich have vitalist elements in these theories. Reich has read Henri Bergson, for example, and according to vitalism, there are vital principles or processes which animate organisms, enabling, for example, their breathing. It can also defend parents' influence over their offspring through impulses. Even though the progress of science has rendered these explanations highly unlikely, we still defend their speculative content can be fruitful for a philosophical reflection, as long as it is clear that the concepts used are no longer scientifically valid, but can nonetheless foster speculation towards new steps. Such is the case with the formative drive and the artificial drive, which enables us this discussion between two distinct fields of knowledge. It has also allowed us to reflect on the impact of architecture and sexuality in our lives. Reich's vitalism will not be approached due to the complexity and controversy it entails. It led to one of the most terrible cases of censorship in the United States. We can talk about it later if you're interested. The FBI went after him and so on. Reich's vitalism can be a topic for further discussion with Schelling's philosophy of nature. And Schelling's philosophy of sexuality can be further developed by its connection with other of his aesthetic and ontological concepts, such as love and sublime. Also, Schelling's philosophy of sexuality can be combined with the method of positive philosophy of the late Schelling, focusing more on singular experiences and contingents than on universal concepts. We still have much to learn from Schelling and the man who dreamed of tomorrow. This is an allusion I make to a biography of Reich, the man who dreamed of tomorrow. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Gabriel. So we have still like 25 minutes or 30 minutes for discussion. And please help yourself if you are thirsty. It's a biological needs and demands. And you can go to the toilet too, but not sex, probably. Okay, so any questions or probably any comments?
Yes, I want to thank you first for your presentation. It was very interesting, and by knowing you, I want to take advantage of the fact that you are both an expert in German Romanticism and psychoanalysis to ask you your opinion about one point. And so, as you mentioned, the concept of libido was one of the most problematic and eventually led to interrupt the relationship between Freud and Jung, and it was one of the most critical points between the two. And of course, it's due to the fact that Jung had a very broader sense of libido as a sort of psychic energy, which is more similar to a physical concept rather than a psychological one. So correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but it's a more broader concept of libido rather than the one that we find in Freud. And the things that I wanted to ask you is which one of the two views is more compatible to an idea of the sexual sublimation or the sexual drive that we can find in the idea of artistic production in German Romanticism, since of course one may think that it's just a red line that goes from nature, from inorganic to organic to the human reflection. There's a red line that drives the artistic production from nature to man, as in German Romanticism. Some of the German Romantics, of course, not everybody. And some others may think that basically Freud was right, and the artistic production presupposes a certain form of sexuality. And as we figured out with Professor Hösle in this weekend, sexual reproduction is a very particular type of reproduction, and is in biology, in another sense, it can be considered a counterintuitive or a counterproductive way of reproductive, because it presupposes a sort of distance between the two mating couple, and so it's a very particular form of biological development. So what I'm asking is the Jung concept of libido as a general psychical energy more coherent with the German Romantic views, or Freud's idea of distance and sublimation of the sexual push that only ultimately belongs only to those organics items that can sexually reproduce, which match perfectly with the German Romanticism idea. Which one of the two is the most coherent with the German Romantic idea of development of art from nature to man?
Oh, okay, Andrea, thank you. Well, I would say Jung's conception of artistic creativity is more Hegelian than romantic. Mm-hmm. Not that Jung gives such a high value to reason as Hegel. He even mentions Hegel is a psychologist in disguise. But this is an interesting idea because in Jung's view, the philosopher per excellence is Kant. He admires a lot Kant, and he has read at least the first and the third critique of his. And he has some criticisms of Hegel, usually not developed, just opinions basically, like this one. He's a psychologist in disguise because he's thinking human mind and everything. But at the same time, his conception of creativity is deeply connected to people's collective, to his concept of collective unconscious, which is related to a sort of a collective mind, to a sort of objective spirit. So of course, there's the differences and everything, but when Jung refers to fairy tales, to patterns in different cultures that seem to follow some kind of teleology, this sounds more Hegelian to me than romantic. And there are some texts of him about artists that I haven't read about Jung, so I could probably give you better answers if I had read. For example, he writes about Pablo Picasso, James Joyce, and many other thinkers. He does not give much importance to sublimation. Besides this discussion with Freud, he develops this idea of psychification. So psychification is the capacity of human mind of transforming contents in superior forms. So you can elaborate a feeling, for example. This is a form of psychification. You can elaborate your emotion through art. This is also a form of psychification. This is in his book called On the Nature of the Psyche. Now, regarding Freud, I think he is closer to Romanticism. Jung also gives huge importance to dreams, but the way Freud works, dreams as having a hidden meaning was very groundbreaking. And not only has he read some romantics, for example, he read Schelling's Philosophy of Mythology and Philosophy of Revelation, but he emphasizes this dimension of the wits, so the jokes and everything, which is very important in Romanticism as well, especially in Schlegel, Friedrich Schlegel, I think. So I would reply this way, that the Freudian views of artistic creativity are closer to Romanticism, and Jungian views are closer to Hegel's conceptions of artistic, the relation between arts and society. Artistic creation itself, I wouldn't know because I haven't read those texts of his. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else?
Yeah, so first of course, thank you for the talk. I find the idea quite interesting to bring these two things together. And I have to say I'm quite convinced this Schelling part, so if I got it right, because the idea is I want to explain that the sexuality in architecture is linked and we can understand something better. As a building street, this makes sense. But as a question, I have to admit that I get a little bit lost in the psychoanalyst part at the moment with Nazism, to get there back to architecture. I see this case as you describe, and with the communist state and the repressive, that this interesting part, I don't get the connection back to what does this exactly mean for architecture, except that the one guy is not start building theaters and cinemas or whatever it was. Can you elaborate?
Oh, sure.
Thanks.
This I'm based. It's more explicit on the text. I'm based here on this interesting author I found. Who is he? Richard J. Williams. He has when I was doing research for this presentation, I came upon a book of his called Sex and Buildings, Modern Architecture and Sexual Revolution. So he is inspired by many thinkers who connect architecture with sexuality, being on the side of repression, being on the side of enabling sexuality. So, according to Williams, Reich is a precursor of discussions such as Foucault's about how buildings can be used to control people, to control bodies. And in Reich's discussion, he is sort of a pioneer because he saw those contradictions in the Soviet Union. They wanted to create a new form of family, but did not provide a proper architecture for this. You didn't have private spaces. This was connected to the control and repression of social life. In the youth communes, people also were reporting on the things you did. You could see what everyone was doing, basically. There was no division between bedrooms, and even the showers had to be collective too. So this kind of situation made it very hard, both for coexistence and even more for sexual gratification, and even more for sublimation according to Reich, because in his conception, sublimation is only possible when the sexual matters of a person are all solved, where he or she or they deal fine with it. This does not mean having sex all the time in Reich's view. There is this misconception of Reich and even of Freud sometimes. This means being more at will with your body, being more free with your body, eventually having sexual intercourse. Yeah. This would lead to what Reich calls an orgastic potency, which is this capacity of dealing better with your body, your own body. It's very interesting when you read Reich, because when you read Freud, sex is always something that people are not having, and it's causing problems. It's basically it. So when Schelling discusses sexuality, it's either about perversions or cases when an individual is having a hard time with sexuality, or the effects of sexual dysfunctions, such as impotence, frigidity, and so forth. But Reich, he discusses what is an orgasm, for example, from the physiological point of view, why is it important. So it's a breath of fresh air in psychoanalysis. It's less abstract and symbolic and negative. It's more connected to the body. So he was very important to this field called bioenergetics and many other fields. Even I think this relation with politics is also very interesting that he develops, because according to him, an unhappy sexual life leads to a body posture that is a hardening. This idea of the panza is a hardening of one's own body. So the people expresses this insatisfaction in their own body. It's very interesting how it develops this.
When I can ask you.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is something I find super interesting. So would you agree that with Schelling we can understand that architecture is a result that follows out of the Bildungstrieb, so that like nature has the idea to include also anorganic and to come to consciousness. So that is why we have architecture, and we can also have it in a good way that we transcend it and make it to fine art if we are really good in that, and not only building a shelter. And in addition, with the psychoanalysts, we can also understand that this world we are building there through our Bildungstrieb can now have two ways. So the one is simply suppressing us and blocking our Bildungstrieb who wants to transcend itself to fine art, or in a way that it's flourishing and it's in this kind of orgastic way that we can produce it. So this is something we can understand when we add the psychoanalysts, that we do not only understand why we are doing architecture, but also how we should do it, that it is appropriate to our Bildungstrieb.
That's a good understanding. I like this connection with Reich you made. I didn't think explicitly about it, but you can infer it from what I've wrote. Yes, it's possible. What's your name? I'm sorry, I forgot.
Matthias.
Matthias. Okay, Matthias. And there is an element in Schelling too that art is always a compromise between this non-conscious side, and consciousness. He will say that genius is the combination of those two activities. So in the case of architecture, what stems more notably from nature, from the non-conscious, is the Bildungstrieb. But the conscious side also counts a lot, it matters. It would be related to the study of the classics, the studying of a theory of determined art, and the practice that you learn in schools. So you can learn what you can learn, Schelling calls art, Kunst. He calls Kunst. The element of genius that is conscious is called by Schelling Kunst. Whereas the element from nature that cannot be taught, that you are born with it, is called Poesie. So the genius in Schelling is a combination of Kunst and Poesie, the conscious and the non-conscious side of artistic creation. And this could sound elitist, but Schelling actually defends that everyone has the unconscious, the non-conscious talent. Everybody has the Poesie. What is hard is Kunst. So he's not elitist here, he's more meritocratic, in fact, that you have to look deeper, to study the classics, to imitate, to practice, to develop the skills, the tools, to practice the arts. You have the power of nature in you, we all have, but the power of spirit must be developed, must be conquered. That's very interesting in his conception. And in the side of, if you think in a dialogue of psychoanalysis, in a further dialogue, in the more Freudian sense, the classic sense, the unconscious side would be connected to the unconscious impulses one has, the sexual desires or the desires of preservation, and the conscious activity would be sublimating, would be a rationalization of your traumas and everything. But yes, it would be something this way, in this classic Freudian mode. And in Reich, it would be that if your biological, if your relation to your body is healthy, you can develop art too. So in Reich, it would be more a causal relation. And to Schelling, it is not, it is parallel. It is an agreement between non-conscious and conscious. Vittorio?
Yeah, thank you, Gabriel. First of all, congratulations on your English. You have delivered very well in English.
Thank you.
And also congratulations on your knowledge on Schelling, philosophy of nature, philosophy of art, and psychological development. The problem I had with your talk is I still don't understand how the three parts really fit together. And I see it more as a research program. So let me begin with the issue that was just discussed, the issue of the unity of conscious and unconscious process in the art. You are completely right that this is very important for Schelling, and perhaps we can explain to the German student that Kunst in Schelling means something like Kunstfertigkeit, Techne, the Greek term Techne, the capacity of using a skill according to certain general rules in order to achieve an end, and therefore it has to be deliberate, while poesy is a feeling, I have to go in this direction. There is no algorithm for that. It's simply an inkling that is based on certain unconscious ideas. Now this was, we already criticized, for example, the romantic insistence on the importance of unconsciousness. This was criticized by Schiller, who was a very conscious author, and he was irritated by the fact that it was said that if you're not completely conscious, you cannot, if you're not delivering yourself to the unconscious, you cannot be a great artist. And I do think that, in fact, artists differ a lot on the fact whether they follow an instinctive grasp of a whole, or whether they work through constant correction and application of technique. It should be a variety of artists. You cannot say one artist is better artist than the other. We have simply two different forms. But the decisive issue is that when Schelling has often been considered a precursor of the theory of the unconscious, because the concept of the unconscious plays a very important role in the system of transcendental idealism as well as in the philosophy of art. But I'm not 100% sure that this really helps us to make a bridge to modern psychoanalysis. Why? Because the concept of the unconscious in Schelling is much, much more general than the Freudian concept. It simply points to the fact that there are a lot of intellectual processes that somehow steer and guide our work without being explicitly lifted up to consciousness. While in Freud, the concept of the unconscious is clearly relegated, connected, as we say, to sexuality. Now, we also know that, for example, a mathematician, in order to prove a difficult theorem, you can say it's an accident where you find the proof. There's no algorithm to get to it. But most people think, well, the way of thinking through certain topics is something unconscious, but somehow builds up certain probably neurological structure in your mind that allows you to get where you want to go. And so there is an unconscious work that we often know. Many mathematicians have described it before, a difficult, important discovery of a solution of a difficult problem. There was an incubation. An incubation is a process that is not delivered. After having looked at various possibilities, you simply let it go, and then suddenly the solution emerges. And it's natural to say there was an unconscious working of your mind. Certain synapses continue to form, and suddenly it creates this insight. But of course, nobody who is in the switch assumes that sexual ideas help you with the finding of mathematical proof. There is no connection between the two. So the theory of Schelling is so much more general about the importance of the unconscious moment of the mind that I find it relatively, let's say, misleading to connect it with Schelling. With Freud. If you want to connect an author with Freud, who was contemporary of the early romantics, you have to go to Schopenhauer. Because in Schopenhauer there is also the idea that the conscious mind is only, if you want, a little tool of an unconscious force, but this unconscious force is very clearly conceived as the sexual drive. So in my eyes, it's Schopenhauer that is the real precursor of Freud, not really Schelling. Then there is a general problem that has often been discussed of the relation between drive and sexuality. Freud, who I do not think is a very precise thinker, is a very good writer, and he has discovered phenomena that nobody has seen before him, so his importance is doubtless, always moves in this fantasy, that he says, when someone points to something that doesn't seem to be sexual, well, but it is sexual because it's a form of drive. It's something that is based on a desire. And, okay, so you mean now by libido, something that is drive in general. And then you say, yes, but there is of course a form of sexual drive. Let me give you a classic example. I don't think that Freud was wrong in discovering children's sexuality. That is a phenomenon that you can observe as father in children, if you don't remember it from your own childhood. The main problem, by the way, that Freud did with regard to children's sexuality is that he thought that all the reports of children about sexual abuse were only desires, projections, and we know unfortunately that sexual abuse on children is quite common. And Freud, by not taking seriously these reports, contributed to the ongoing abuse, because he said it's only a fiction, a fantasy of a child that imagines the fantasy comes out of desires of the child. But an example that in our class we have mentioned a few times, Irenaeus Idolides said, you know, the people by Konrad Lorenz. Konrad Lorenz, he gives the following example. Well, the breast is attractive to males, that's well known. Now, one explanation that Idolides thinks is the real thing is that for children, for babes, obviously to suck at mother's breast is absolutely crucial. It's the satisfaction of the hunger of the first. They find rest in it. It's simply the primordial experience. And it's natural, since it is connected to such a satisfaction, that this desire remains in the adult. But the Freudian thing is that since later it is connected to sexual desire, it says the child, in fact, has a sexual excitement when she or he sucks the breast. And that seems absurd to me. The fact that there's a strong desire of the baby towards the breast, and that this desire later is loaded sexually, does not prove that in the child this desire is a sexual desire. It's simply, by way of classical association psychology, you can explain why this desire is there. And so you project back, and so again, you say, yes, there's a strong desire of the child, okay. Why is it sexual desire? Well, because it is a very strong desire. I mean with sexuality only desire in general, okay, you can use the language in the same way, but then you say that in fact it's really sexual desire, as we know from later things. And that is simply inadmissible in my eyes, from an intellectual point of view. And finally, you transition to Reich. I must confess I've never read Reich, but when I was a student, an old man, it was in the past millennium, I don't exaggerate when I say it was in the past millennium, there was a marxistische, reichistische Initiative, the Marxian Reichian Initiative at all German universities. And the products that they delivered in student mentors, I often like to look at them because I could not stop laughing at the stupidity of these people. So it was an interesting thing. The whole idea of these people was really that you would create the wonderful society by allowing all people to have as much sex as they wanted. And ultimately, Reich, who developed this idea, then was somehow tamed and brought into a better tune with American society by Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse, man ist auch his last, but late work by him, Eros and Civilization, Betriebsstrukturengesellschaft, is fundamentally based on the assumption that Freud was a conservative. Freud was, as you are completely right and correct, traditional conservative, thought the health of a society presupposes control of sexuality. And I think he's obviously right. And every person who believes that if everyone satisfies the sexual drives, we will have a wonderful society, is insane. And many women would be raped immediately. Yeah? So it's extremely important that people understand that we cannot satisfy their sexual desire when it arises. But the idea of Marcuse was allow, at least, he would not say raping is allowed, but as much consensual sex as possible, and then capitalism will disappear, competition will disappear, and we'll have the wonderful society. And the infantilism of this theory is simply beyond belief. We do not want to now discuss the issue of whether sexual promiscuity is good for the people who engage in sexual promiscuity or not. My experience, since when I grew up, it was relatively widespread. The communes in the Soviet Union could not be built because they didn't have the space for doing so. There were economic constraints. Were much more frequent in university towns than in Moscow. In Western university towns, in Turkey or whatever, than in Moscow, because there was more money and therefore also more space. Not sure it led to great psychological balance. But what is quite clear is the problem of the consequences of sexuality. And connected with this sexual revolution was the enormous pressure to deny rights of unborn children. That was very, very much connected to that. And this was regarded as a solution of all social problems, and sometimes it happened that children were conceived, it happened, when the strong pressure was that you must have a right to eliminate these children. That was part of the program. And it led then to the strong legalization of abortion, etc. Now, we don't want now to go into detail into this complex issue because there are obviously serious tensions. But it seems to me that these Reichian, Marcusian ideas are so distant from a realistic account that here I do think that Freud is in many aspects a much more reasonable person. Freud also thinks that sexual repression can make people unhappy, but as he says, society needs a certain amount of unhappiness to be kept floating and to be kept functioning. And it is naive, as he famously says, happiness is not inbuilt in the plan of nature. That may be very tough, but probably there is something to it. The last point I want to make is the sublimation issue. You are completely right that Freud and Reich differ with regard to the concept of sublimation. Freud fundamentally thinks that sublimation in the sense of renouncing sexual desire can help artistic creation. While Reich would say, no, artistic creation is if we satisfy our sexual desires. And I frankly do not see any empirically plausible connection between the amount of sex in which you engage and your creativity. Simply cannot see it. No doubt Michelangelo was one of the greatest artists of all times. As far as we know, he lived a completely celibate life. Picasso was one of the most promiscuously living men. Even in his in 85, he tried to drag his daughter-in-law into bed. We know this beyond any doubt. And he was very creative. There's a lot that Picasso is one of the great geniuses of the art. I simply don't see any causal connection between the two things. Max Scheler, who I think I need to look at because he was one of the first persons who, although strongly influenced by the tradition of German Naturphilosophie, took Freud seriously, makes fun of this sublimation theory, still of Freud, not of Reich, by saying, with all due respect for the monasteries, it's not true that the monasteries had a monopoly on intellectual achievements. There were a lot of intellectual achievements done outside of monastery, but he of course does not deny that in monasteries there were important intellectual achievements. So I simply don't manage to see any empirical correlation between the amount of sexual activities in which you engage and the quality of the outcome. So this would be some objections.
Oh, thank you, Vittorio. Well, regarding the first point, the mention I make at the beginning of the test is that Schelling's Bewusstlos would at best relate to Schelling's Bewusstlos would at best relate to Freud's descriptive unconscious. Maybe I could have expanded this more. What I mean by this is that a descriptive account of unconscious is related to different levels of the human mind, according to Freud. The important one, he has two divisions, but the important one here is the one that is presented in the interpretation of dreams. The conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. So, when you mention those many conceptions that we have of unconscious processes, usually people have in mind preconscious, the Vorbewusstsein, instead of unconscious. Like contents that we don't perceive, we don't pay much attention to them, we don't perceive or process properly. That would be one point. Regarding Schopenhauer, indeed Freud read a lot of his philosophy and explicitly quotes him in the Beyond the Pleasure Principle and other texts. Freud has a very hostile attitude to philosophy, an ambiguous connection to philosophy actually. Sometimes he uses philosophy when he is being heavily criticized. For example, in the essays about sexuality, Freud says, oh no, when I'm talking about sexuality, I'm referring to the eros of the divine Plato. Or when he tries to review his theory of drive, presenting the idea of a death drive and Auf Heben, his duality between sexual drives and self or ego drives, subsuming them into the life drives, he says, oh, now we are at the haven of Schopenhauer's philosophy. So he has this rhetorical use of philosophy, but mostly he is very critical of it. For example, Brentano's he was a student of Franz Brentano, and he many times refers, not explicitly, but he does not mention the professor, maybe out of respect, but he refers many times to an objection Brentano makes in the psychology from an empirical standpoint about the idea of a conscious unconsciousness. How could we be conscious of the unconscious, somehow analog to the idea of a thing in itself, but in a psychological level. So Freud criticizes Brentano. He has this idea that the philosopher, this caricature of the philosopher as an obsessive, compulsive, neurotic. He invented this diagnostic, this psychiatrical category that now we call it the OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Freud called it Zwangsneurose. So for example, the obsessive compulsive would not tolerate seeing a glass here. He would immediately try to put it in a safer place. He's always worried about the control of a situation. So the philosopher would be this, according to Freud, or a paranoid. So it's not a very good portrait of the philosopher he makes. And even so, he does extract a lot from Schopenhauer, from Schiller too. He is one of his favorite philosophers and writers.
Have you any proof that he ever read Schelling?
Yes, he mentions it in the interpretation of dreams. He quotes the philosophy of mythology, and also in the text Das Unheimliche, he quotes the philosophy of revelation. He uses Schelling's idea of unheimlich to try to introduce his ideas of the uncanny.
But he never quotes on system of transcendental idealism or philosophy of art.
No, this was something I did not as a genetic work, not as the influence of Schelling, neither in Freud nor Reich, but more an attempt of confronting the different views on sexuality and architecture, and especially because the philosophy of art was a very late publication due to its posthumous character. So it would have been hard to have access to in the case of Freud, not so much in the case of Reich, but in the case of Freud.
Excuse me, the book was published in the 1850s, if I rightly remember.
Yes.
So Freud was born in the 1850s, so there was
Freud could have
accessible in his time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. In Freud's case, he also could have had access to it. That is true. The other point was about Reich's theory. Indeed, he does have some strange moments and strange ideas too, but I'm doing this work of trying to find the gold in there, because I see there are some rich and interesting insights. And also this connection between repression and sexuality is even Michel Foucault recognizes Reich as an important development in this field. But he had some weird, really interesting ideas. He had this idea of an orgone accumulator. This itself could also be a topic for a discussion with design and architecture. This idea was about a sort of, not exactly a box, sort of a box in the size of a people could enter that would isolate heat and electricity and many forms of energy, light, and would enable only this life force he calls orgone to enter there. So people would enter there for a while, relax, and then be more organized, more with this orgastic energy. He even wrote to Albert Einstein about this. Albert Einstein did in fact go there. He had such a good heart that he went. He entered an orgone accumulator, and he did notice a difference of temperature, but then he writes to Reich like, yeah, maybe it was just the weather, I don't buy this idea. Then he stopped writing to Reich, but he was open to him at first. That's a very funny episode in the history of Albert Einstein's correspondences. He corresponded to Freud too, they have some beautiful exchanges. And Freud, very arrogant person, wrote to Einstein once, maybe someday he will become my disciple, who knows? Very silly, very silly. But indeed, I am trying to do this more. I'm trying to use the principle of charity to a high extent with Reich, because I admit he does have some insane ideas, but at the same time his analysis of character and his reflection on his criticism of fascism particularly interests me. How the fascist attitudes reflects on the person's bodies. They become like very stiff, and even the chins become like more tightened. He has this material called the Mass Psychology of Fascism, which is a very interesting and kind of forgotten book of his from his earlier periods.
Yeah, it may say something on that. If you look at National Socialism in Germany, one important part of National Socialism was the sexual revolution. Compared with the sexual models that existed before in traditional German families, where Nazis instilled much more sexual activities. So it's not true that National Socialism was based on a strong suppression of sexuality. It's simply historically not true.
Maybe the opposite. They were trying to push the reproductive rate of the German race, and they were forcing people to even adopt the orphans of other countries, but that still was corresponding to the characteristic of the German race.
No, that's interesting. I didn't know that, and it points to a problem in psychoanalysis, which is the use of historical sources. It's usually not very, since Freud, it's usually not very accurate. Carl Jung, on the other hand, But Jung is different because he was initially a psychoanalyst, then he developed his own psychology, analytical psychology. Jung was better with the use of historical sources. He read many foreign languages and he was more precise in this aspect. But it's good to know that Reich repeats this mistake from Freud. It will be more careful with those matters. Elena?
Oh yeah, towards the end, like you mentioned how the problem in the Soviet Union was that they couldn't distinguish between the pathological sexuality and the healthy sexuality, and I just was kind of curious about that point and what the difference is between those that the author sees.
Oh, I see. Well, Freud has this idea that childish sexuality is perverse and polymorphous. What does he mean by that? That it is perverse because Freud, as a very conservative person, believes that the aim of a sexual relationship is basically the reproduction. And so he believes that foreplay, oral sex, all other kinds of sexual interactions are perverse, are called perversions. He would consider the use of fetishes and everything, he considers them the perversions. So he has three basic kinds of pathologies. Neurosis, which is the basic human condition to him. If you're neurotic, it's good, because it could be worse. Then you have psychosis, which are usually bring a lot of suffering and a separation from reality, and the perversions. Lacan will approach this a lot too. He will develop this a lot from Freud. So the perversions, they can be fetishism, the scopophilia, like voyeurism, and how would you say it? Sadomasochism. Those would be the main the main kinds of perversions, and they all, according to Freud, ring back to childhood. For example, when you bite, when the kid starts to bite, it develops this sense that it can hurt, destroy things, and so on. So this, at least according to Freud, would be a kind of perverse sexuality. I would have to look deeper in this text, in this passage, if Reich is meaning pathological in this sense, or in the Freudian sense, or in another sense. But when he means the healthy sexuality, it means especially the ability of not worrying during the sexual activity. Not worrying if you will have an orgasm, or if your partner will have an orgasm, just enjoying the moment, just releasing, letting yourself go, having a moment of not concerning with the situation, just letting it happen.
Okay, so I guess there is a lot of drive in this group, but we have to put an end to it because we exceeded a little time time window. So thank you for great contribution from the floor and the wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Tomoki.
And have a good evening. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomoki.
Yeah, I just